advanced world-class engineering right here in Australia if we get ourselves on the same page. So without much further ado, Anna, please take it away.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. It's really an honor to host this particular panel. I've really enjoyed talking to the panel members over the past few days and learned so much. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So I'll just quickly introduce the panel, if that is okay. Not that you can't do that yourselves, but closest to me is Mr. Andrew Seedhouse, Chief of Intelligence, Surveillance and Space at DST, at Space Division at DST. Then we have Air Vice Marshal Chris Deeble, retired AO, Executive Director of Northrop Grumman. Next is Commodore Nick Hogan, Director General of the Space Domain Review. And finally, we have Marshal Warren McDonald, retired. There's so many letters after your name. AO, CSC, CEO of Lockheed Martin, Australia and New Zealand. So welcome. Thank you very much. So the panel are very keen to just get going on answering questions. They all want to be very provocative, is what they said when we had the... And so we're going to do some quick fire questions first. And if there's time at the end, we'd love to have some audience Q&A too. Okay, so given the panel is on global space security trends, the first question it'll be on that one. So ASAT tests are back in the news, and so they're destructive, raise public awareness, etc. But they also feel like they're a little bit of a distraction from what the real issues are. So what are the current space security trends, as far as you can discuss? And perhaps, maybe more importantly, what are the opportunities out of these new trends, especially for Australia? So we can be very broad here, raise technology, regulation, multi-missions, anything. And we'll start with Andrew first.
I think it's worth responding to the ASAT issue in terms of distraction. For those of you not aware, the sort of impact those sort of missions, which are, put this way, frowned upon. Because the recent one, for example, you imagine an interceptor that occurs and you get this poof cloud that is created. It creates two plumes, one the way the interceptor's going, one the way the satellite's going. And then this tens of thousands of debris then spreads out across the whole orbit. And that whole orbit is then full of junk. And that junk at that altitude is going to take over a decade to drag itself down. So that means that orbit's had it for the foreseeable future. So they're a distraction because they don't really need to demonstrate those things. It's a complex weapon mission. That's relatively easy to do. I'm not sure why nations want to go and do that other than making a statement. I think for us, though, and I think going back to Mike's talk yesterday, the key areas of interest for threat which are more likely to be in use are in the traditional electronic warfare and in the cyber arena. Anywhere where you've got an aperture, where you've got something listening or looking, is an access point and is a vulnerability for traditional EW, and cyber, of course, through the comms links and other data pieces where we would see significant possibilities for interaction. And therefore, especially in the engineering, R&D and S&T community, that's where we're focusing effort in terms of hardening and protecting systems, the same way we do in any other system that's on an earth or air platform. They're very important for us to do that. I have actually made a list as well, so I can cheat, because we did say we were talking earlier. Another area for us in terms of mitigating some of the risks is moving from systems which are made up of formations of satellites to multi-purpose systems. So you talk about 9102, which is predominantly a comms system. We would like to see in the future that we have satellites that can do comms, GeoInt, and other functions concurrently, so that there's that resilience in terms of failure if they are being attacked. Also, we see lots of satellite systems at the moment which are formations of satellites. I'd rather we move to mesh systems where they're fully connected and information can flow around the planet very quickly and through a mesh. That gives us more resilience to some of the security threats we see. And also that opens the door as well to take away another vulnerability we have, which are ground stations, which are essentially just targets. So if we have mesh systems, we can drop information up and down from the mesh anywhere on the planet to an operator. So those are the sort of things that will help us in the future in the technology development to be more resilient in space to those sort of threats, which are in the EW and cyber area. Do you want me to do opportunities, or do you want to move on?
If it's quick.
Opportunities, yeah. Okay, so I was fortunate to have a chat with JAXA in Japan. I was asking them, what opportunities does Australia have compared to themselves in space for the future? One of the key things they mentioned is you don't have, that's us, Space One infrastructure and all those costs. You know, there's big launch site areas, big facilities that are there for the Space One era, and they are sinking costs from them. They're sucking those down. We don't have any of that. We're starting on a clean page in, if you like, era 2. So that creates an opportunity for us to have the appropriate technologies, which a number of other European and North American and others have got that problem of all those people employed doing those things which they have to fund. A strange non-security thing, but it's a big opportunity for the nation. The other one is, I was going to nick that CubeSat and bring it out here to show you. Standardization is another key thing for the future. The fact we had U formats created meant the whole CubeSat market could be created. Classically, in any product development, standardization makes a huge difference. And if we can then move up in scale to, I use white goods a lot to describe satellites, up the mini bar and the fridge and then the double-sized fridge. Those standards, we can create standards in that era and do that first. We can then get quickly going on terms of integrating the effect of payloads and satellites in Australia. If we do it first, others will follow if we're lucky. So there's some opportunities for us there. And the final one I have is something we're really, really good at, and that is AI processing on the edge and turning satellites into true intelligent robots. I think that's something that's keen for us.
Exciting.
That's me, hog the light.
Comments from, Chris.
Yeah, I think yesterday was very interesting when Secretary Bazula, apart from suggesting that I knew about typing pools and that from the olden days, alluded to critical infrastructure and systems of national significance.
Mike.
You've gone mute.
So that's probably indicative. I am an old guy and technology will fail.
Is that on? Is that on? No.
You have to turn it on as well. Or he does. Yeah.
Okay, you should be good.
Hello.
You good?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think Secretary Bazula talked yesterday around critical infrastructure and systems of national significance. And to pick up on Andrew's point, this is not just about defence. It's actually about the civil. There's contest in all of those domains. So it's important to understand then what does that mean. So the cyber threat that Andrew alluded to, will be a critical one. So as we're looking, and maybe I will make a counter comment to Secretary Bazula's comment, and I think Andrew alluded to it, is that as we're building our space infrastructure, we're going to have to make sure it's secure by design. We have that opportunity. We're starting from a lower base, compared to many nations that have been playing in space for 70 plus years. So as we're doing that, that will be really critical. And the architecture that underpins our ability to utilise space, to exploit what comes from space, will become really critical. I note that in this conference, it's been very interesting over the last couple of days that it's easy to focus on launch, satellites and payload. But the fear that I have, based on my defence time, is about the ground segment, about space control. And as we move from a nation that's had access to services from space or access to payloads and controlling certain parameters around those payloads to now controlling the whole payload, controlling the whole satellite, controlling the constellation of satellites that might sit somewhere between GEO, MEO and LEO, this becomes a very serious problem. And it is the one that really needs to be architected. We need to make sure it's secure by design. And when we talk about sovereignty and resilience, this is fundamental, to Australia having sovereign and resilient capability. Because if we can't control that, than the digital economy that relies on it. The commercial advantage that we're seeking for Australian industry and the advantages that we want to exploit from a defence perspective will be lost.
And if I can just add something
Please.
to the Russian satellite or anti-satellite test, I guess it shows there's not many countries that can do that. It's a pretty big statement if it was done on purpose. And I would say that if that had been done in another environment, sea, land, air, and left some sort of damage for decades to come, someone would have done something. And we haven't done that in space because there's a lack of responsible behaviours, regulation, depends how you want to look at life. But in terms of the way, the trends that we're moving, my other esteemed panel colleagues have articulately summarised, I would say self-protection for our satellites. I mean, that's something that we need to understand. We need to understand what has happened to the satellite and therefore be able to attribute it. So does that mean we've got cameras on the satellites? Does that mean we have awareness of what's going on with those things? Those sort of trends need to emerge. No different to what we've got in the other domains.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is a worrying set of circumstances when a country does that, but there are a list of those who have undertaken those types of behaviours, but at the detriment of everyone in the room, because it will impact you if we are isolated from space. So everyone's aware of the Kessler effect, and if that does occur and we get to where Dr. Paul Scully said and start putting hundreds of thousands of satellites in space, and if it all goes wrong, we deny it for generations to come. And I think that's very worrying. The global commons isn't the best place for human behaviour. If you look at the internet, it's a good example of those sort of aspects. People haven't played well there, but space has a more tactile element to it. It's a bit like looking at the ocean. If we all get it wrong, and underneath, 3 feet underneath, there's a steel plate, which you can never go to the bottom on. And you deny it for hundreds of years. So we have to be vocal in our opinions of such activity. Otherwise, all the effort, all the money that people in this room hope to derive from space, all the gains we hope to derive from it, will be lost forever. And it'll only come down to being vocal, trying to put in some regulations, but as we said, globally, that is a difficult space to regulate. But we're going to have to try and get on top of it because one false move can be catastrophic for everybody.
And I'll just add that the speed at which, or the pace at which we're moving in space, it means that it's no longer a state domain. So big states don't need to get to space. They don't need a lot of effort to get there. So we're going to see non-state actors getting in there, and you know what that means in our traditional domains when that happens. So we need to be very cautious of that.
Great. And can I maybe just tease open something too? So last week we heard about Peter Dutton. We heard Peter Dutton talk here, in fact, in this room, about our approach to security on a much more global level than just space. And it was a two-pronged approach. Obviously the AUKUS is number one, plan A as it were, but the plan B is that we work better with our regional countries, and you can see where I'm coming from here. Is space that area, that topic that can gel the activities of the regional, the Southeast Asian Pacific, given that the sophistication of countries like, Japan's a space power, we're going to hear more about that later, but Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, they have amazing programs and they're more than capable of reeling out small sats and above, no problem at all. And we can learn from them to do civil missions for agriculture, food, migration, the lot. Ties us together. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, science and technology is always used, which is the field I'm in, as one of the first tools in diplomacy. So I know that we have re-engaged with Korean and Japanese officials to talk about just that issue, about what can we do more, starting first of all with the sort of less policy driving things we can do by collaboration with R&D. That then leads to those relationships being more comfortable in that technology, in that space, which leads to further then conversations about what can we do together. I think the problem with space is it isn't national, it isn't regional, it's global. We lack a space council where you get planning permission from. We have a space council where you pay your taxes to and they provide the rubbish truck that clears up the rubbish. There isn't anything like that happening. So it is fly tipping and the Wild West at the moment. And I think even if we do something regional, stuff that can happen elsewhere on the planet will affect the region. So we're unique in that respect. There's nothing we can contain. Things always fly around the planet. So I think until we get into that position where global security sits down and arranges something, and we don't have a good track record of being able to do that, then those things will be fixed. Otherwise, we'll always be affected by someone doing something daft.
Yeah. It's the proximity of immaturity to power. You see it on the internet. Immaturity permeates through and to powerful things, and they do that without wisdom. And that's the same thing that will happen to space, given digitalisation in production, easy access. Those with lack maturity will cause great problems for others.
There's also opportunities, though. From the Australian perspective, we do Foreign Fisheries Agency patrols. Defence Force aircraft go out there and they patrol the fisheries area. I mean, you could have steering permanents from space. They can solve those issues by watching from space and telling the Southwest Pacific nations where people are fishing in their territories. There is opportunities there, and that would save aircraft to do other things, maybe even environmentally more friendly.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and I think, when you look at the Indo-Pacific, the grey zone tactics that are evident here, how we can support, our allies within the region becomes really important. But I think the other point that was raised yesterday is about global norms and global norms for space, and Andrew sort of talked to some of those issues. I think that is critical, that Australia maintains that moral high ground, is seen to be, using space in a consistent, reasoned and reasonable way, for good, rather than for, using that for other advantages.
Thanks. Okay, so let's just move on to how we upskill our own industry. That question. So, how do we get to the right level of investment to upskill our SMEs as real options for defence for selection of large contracts? Primes aren't the longer-term option for a sovereign industry. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, but nor can we do this story without them. So how do we manage the tension that might come out of that? And this would be to Nick first.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. So, no, we'd already pre-arranged this one. So I better have a good answer. Right? The discussion around primes versus the small, medium enterprise and getting Australian sovereign industry moving forward. Sovereign means a lot to different people. So from a defence perspective or from a national security perspective, do we need to own the architecture in space in order to have sovereign rights? So can we control it through contracting and therefore holding companies to account? Companies have a name, a brand that they must maintain. So there is that discussion that still goes around in defence. But when it comes to issues of national security, when it comes to the time that we must get that service and we must need that, and we've made it very clear in our Defence Strategic Update that space is critical to our warfighting effectiveness, and that's a very well-known statement, and it's something that we trot out all the time. That we need to be able to rely on that space capability at that time when we need it. So therefore, a lot of people are leaning towards we must own it. That doesn't get me to the point, which is your question, which is where we go to developing the Australian sovereign industry. So in terms of sovereign industry, should the sovereign industry be looking at creating its own ecosystem just for Australia? And I don't see necessarily that opportunity. What I would see is that Australia should be contributing to the global enterprise and taking advantage of that scale, especially when we looking at our infrastructure with our allies and our international partners, our close allies and international partners. So certainly over the next 10 or so years, some of the bigger defence projects can't necessarily be serviced as it would appear as we've gone out to contract by Australian companies. So primes are required in order to help us get to that point. But we should be looking for further tranches down track and how we will get to servicing those needs for defence. That being said, though, Australian industry is incredibly innovative, and the stuff that I see through academia and small startups is incredible. The problem is we always have trouble getting it from those TRL levels of and Andrew can speak to this, the 2 to 3 to 4 level up to the TRL 7 and then therefore into production. And that's where that scale comes. And when defence, from our perspective, we are behind in the space capability game. We have a capability architecture which is fit for an uncontested space or an uncontested domain. We need to be able to move faster, and to move at the speed of relevance, we need to move really quickly at the moment. Thanks.
To pick up on a couple of Nick's points there, I think it is up to primes to assist SMEs. Lockheed Martin does do that through various programs. We have Ronson Gears as a good example of actually putting something in space from Australia. But I think what is difficult is, and I'm going to pull on this one, is the culture of Australia. So the culture of Australia would, a small, medium enterprise startup, the first thing they're asked if they come, this is the lament, when they go to defence is, the first question they're asked is, who uses it? If they go to the US, they're asked, what's your capability? Let's have a look at it. That seems subtle in its difference, but it is quite different in its culture. We talk about wanting to take risk as a country. We talk about innovation. We talk about all those other things. But are we truly ready to take that risk? Truly. Because if you go to US and everyone talks about Silicon Valley and talks about the fantastic aspects of it all, it's a bloodbath when it all goes wrong. Thousands of people laid off in a day. Are we a country prepared for that? Is it in our psyche to really want that? Or do we prefer a more comfortable safety net that sits in underneath as opposed to a set of spikes that's in the United States of America if you hit bottom? There is a cultural difference, and that drives innovation because there's no turning back. It's like the conquistadors. You drill holes in the side of the boat and then, okay, let's go and conquer a country. That is... I'm being a little controversial, but there's an element inside us that we need to look at. And also, in Australia, we need to start celebrating others' success genuinely. If you go to the United States of America, they celebrate other people's success genuinely. We have I'll be frank, a immature approach to it, a high school approach, a tall poppy approach. We've got to get away from that. We've got to celebrate those people that do things that are extraordinary and not just on the sports field. It's about our young women and children who can be, women and boys who can be the scientists of the future and enabling them. Have friends out in the middle of nowhere, right? I come from Hay, New South Wales, so that's, you might say, yep, you're out in the middle of nowhere, that's factual. I have two sons, incredibly intelligent in mathematics and a whole host of other things. They went to their privates, to the school in the local, and got bullied. Okay? They had to put them into boarding school so they could protect them. One of them's up in Queensland. He started doing high school mathematics in primary school. The other lad is incredibly reserved, but he only needs to read something once, remembers it. Not only does he remember it, but he can understand the context of it all. So he's doing studies for international studies in ANU and helping people do biochem at the same time because he's got the spare capacity in his brain. Okay, but what kind of... We need to look at ourselves and ask why as a nation aren't we... do we do that to our youth? Do we do that to people with obvious talent? And they're the kind of people that will bring us above and beyond what we are currently capable of as a nation and take that risk and move forward to the levels we should do.
And I think, to pick up on some of Macca's points, sitting in companies like Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Airbus, Boeing, any of the big space primes is 60 to 70 years worth of heritage. If we want to accelerate here in Australia, we've got to learn how to actually harness that, to bring the know-how, the know-why that exists in those companies to Australia to help us get there faster on that journey. So yesterday I thought it was interesting. We talked about the space nation. We talked about, the space ecosystem. We talked about space industry. Now, I've been 37 years in defence. We used to talk about defence industry. This is the first conference that I've seen that we're now talking about space industry. That's a good start. But we have to change that from the rhetoric into the reality. Now, I'm ex-defence. I played in CASG for many years. And I watch now, the defence approach, Gate 0, Gate 1, Gate 2, for approving projects. Gate 0 is the most critical of the defence gates. Now, you might argue Gate 2 is where government approves and gives you money, but at the end of the day, you don't get to Gate 2 if you haven't got Gate 0 right around that strategy. So what's Defence doing at Gate 0? They're looking at industry outcomes, they're looking at concepts, they're looking at skilling and STEM, they're looking at R&D investments or otherwise. Guess what industry is doing at that point in time and primes are doing at that point in time? We're looking at industry, we're looking at IRAD investments, we're looking at skilling and STEM, we're looking at all the same things. Here in Australia, when we talked yesterday about the coherence and alignment, we talked about being able to leverage the investments that we're making to get more than the sum of the individual parts. That's what's required, that's strategic alignment. You know, where we can actually have those conversations, where primes understand where we're going, we're aligned strategically to both the civil and the defence strategies, and hopefully a national strategy for space. That allows that better alignment. It allows us to harness the know-how and know-why of the primes. And at the core of many of these ecosystems will sit a prime or a number of primes that are helping to orchestrate and support small to medium enterprise. And that is the responsibility of the primes to do that and have a sovereign understanding of what that means and help bringing, you know, those understandings of the resilient architectures and those other things that are key for Australia.
If I may just talk about the defence angle on this, and some builds on some of the points that Macca made earlier. Risk is part of innovation, and of course a lot of you out there know more about this than I, because you've got these big loans and you've got your mortgage on your house for your business and things like that. You're taking those risks directly. But looking internally to defence, do we have the innovation processes to work in this environment to get that tempo going? And I think there is doubt. And the doubt is confirmed by the fact that's why we're doing an innovation review at the moment. In fact, it's probably just about to finish. I know a number of people in terms of industry as well as internal to defence were encouraged to participate. And Melissa, who was here earlier, she will probably be getting a briefing this week or next week on the outcomes of that. I don't know what they are because it's an independent review. But that could take us down a path where we had a good serious look at ourselves in terms of how innovative we are in defence, and then probably then do something about it. I think the other thing then is look at what are the messages defence is making. At the moment we have a strategic industrial capability policy development piece, a SICP in space. That was also mentioned earlier, I think, today. That is in its creation phase, and I've pointed out to the team doing that to come to teams like this. I know the SIAA, I've actually pointed them at it as well, to try and get a look at what it is that we feel is important to defence in terms of capability, coming back to that stage. Note that isn't all about, necessarily do we own the stuff, but can we have access to the technology? I think Mike Prazulia was talking about that as well. But there will be some statements in there which will be important to us in terms of how then we can make investments in the future and look at those Gate 0 decisions that we're making. So watch out for that SICP when it comes out. That's an important one. I suspect the PIVA Innovation Review, some of that will be broadcast as well.
Just picking up on the national there, because we've heard that a lot the last few months and yesterday as well. So you're in charge of setting the national strategy for space in Australia, the best you can do. There's 3 things you can do, 3 bullet point things. What are they? Where does the agency need to be to do that, which includes its budget?
So,
that's not on the list.
no, it's not you.
I just want to be clear.
Okay. So far as Father Christmas, what would I want to have done? I think there's a number of issues. One is in terms of the industry is in a competitive, has to compete. And we're at an embryonic stage. We know we've got some larger companies that are resident here which are helping, but majority of the capability is in 80 to 100 or so smaller industries. First step is that to kickstart stuff, you do need government help. Government investment in, I must say it again, science and technology is the starting point for that. Key thing, though, is a change for Australia is to try and get those bodies we had on the panel yesterday from the BOM and Geoscience, Defence, Space Agency, to actually bring together the 26 individual space policy and plans that we have in this country to one. I mean, why would we have more than one? I'm happy for the flag holder to be ASA on this. I think that's where we would do that. So that'd be one of my, could you please deliver that for Christmas? The other one is a bit more of an understanding of how to build an industry. It doesn't happen very often that you get a new industry, and Defence has sort of got a piece of this, because we're building a new capability domain. It's not very often we build a new domain, and so we're learning how to do that, but at the same time building a new space industry. And who's an expert at building new industries? It's a difficult thing to do. And within that, though, it means that we have to have an understanding of what are the pathways to product. There's a lot of investment. There's hundreds of millions of dollars being spent by government in Australia on space technology, but it's in bits. Make me one of those, make me one of those. How does it come together to make product, and how does that product then deliver services so that you out there have got customers who are paying you money? And that's the missing bit for me, I think, in the next point, was how to create those, like we call them concepts to capability in defence, but especially it's concepts to customers and product, which is missing, and getting that pulled together to make this industry. I suppose the last step is, and something completely out of my control, is that we need scaling up, especially for defence. We either need companies to come together to merge and buy each other out and get to scale, so we've got some larger companies to do business with, or folks like these integrate Australian capability in the same manner, so that we can actually put large high-risk projects out there on Australian suppliers, which we can't do easily today. That's the three.
And I think, to just pull a couple of threads from what Andrew's just said, one of the key issues that we've got to address is we can't be stovepiped anymore. So when you mentioned, Enrico, what should ASA do? I think the answer is that it's about Enrico and Kath Roberts. It's got to be a national strategy. You have to start from that national basis. And the Venn diagrams, from Enrico looking at the civil and from, Kath looking at defence, the overlap is very, very significant at the end of the day. So the coherence and alignment in the strategic environment, understanding where Australia is going to focus our efforts, because we can't be all things to all people, will be really important. And Enrico and Kath, I think, will play, a very significant role in being able to drive that strategy. Inherent in that is actually making sure that whatever money we've got, we get more than the sum of the individual parts of that, that it is done in a coordinated fashion. And underpinning that will be, three key aspects. It's the infrastructure. What do we really need to do what we think we need to do? How do we establish that in a very cost-effective way? Because, Andrew's point, it has to be viable. We want a sustainable, industry base here, not one that is fits and starts. We want to get a sustainable, long-term, viable space industry here in Australia. So the infrastructure is part of it. Skilling and STEM, actually building the workforce with the ability to be able to play in space for now into the future. Supported by know-how, know-why from the primes, bringing that 60 to 70 years worth of heritage. And we definitely need to understand what it takes to upskill business, and build those things that are capable of making companies viable, in the space business. The regulatory environment, the quality requirements of that. If you get that right, get the strategy right, then you can actually truly be a space nation.
I'm going to sound like a broken record here, because my top three is a national space strategy. That would be number one. We have a civil strategy. We almost have a defence space strategy. It's coming. And then it would be nice to have something sitting over the top. The second thing would be a lead civil agency, whole of government. We don't have that. Defence should not be the lead whole of government. We are not for anything else that's national security-wise until it becomes defence of the nation. So there needs to be a national agency that leads in space. And then the third one, give me the room to manoeuvre. That's an internal defence issue, so it's governance. So governance in dollars and accountability, I'm happy to take the accountability, give me the room to manoeuvre, and I can move fast and get us our national security sorted from a defence perspective.
I remember meeting a USAF 3-star at a satellite production facility, and he quickly worked out I wasn't the smartest guy in the room, and I quickly worked out he was. So I decided, well, what a better person to learn from. So I asked a question. I said, what do you regret every day? Okay, so it's always a good one to elicit conversation. So he said, I regret every day that I didn't think far enough ahead to what I should have put on a satellite before I launched it. That was a pretty powerful sort of sentence, which I took away. And every time I look at space, I see it as a strategic game. You have to think far enough ahead to get to where you need to be, and it goes through everything. So for Australia, we need to work out where on that value chain we want to be. Are you going to be right at the top, or are you going to be in the services? Whereabouts do you fit? And given the size of our economy and what we can muster, that's an important question we need to ask. And there won't be, there'll be losers and winners in all that. Okay. So then I also look at, it comes to next, give me the freedom of movement. Let me just get on with it. With that, I think as humans, we overestimate the advances in technology in the short term, but underestimate them in the long term. And they quickly bloom in the windscreen, and we'll see that with space, and we see that with digitalised production and so forth, and it brings the future faster than you anticipated. Then I look at, if we're going to start doing these major projects like 9102, 799 with GEO, we need to make sure the requirements aren't so rigid that they're set in stone, because we are then putting into space something that is redundant. It can't be so flexible that you never actually get around to making something, or too broad that it causes complications, but it has to be set somewhere along that chain. So I think for me, think strategically, be selective, and before we start signing up to a project, make sure you've got, for those who need to use it, the requirements not so rigidly set that, schedule's important, but it will drive an outcome. It'll drive an outcome that you'll launch into space something you regret, like the 3-star that I spoke to. So make sure you give them enough latitude to get modern technology, adaptable satellite technology into space so you can cater for the threats that come.
Can I just add, because there is actually a good news story as well here about one of the areas within the space domain, and that's in space domain awareness. The way in which we, in Defence and the Civil, are working together on that, and also the capability and competencies in Australia to deliver what we need is already there. So was it last week or the week before, we had a Lot 14 joint exercise with ASA, and one of my teams was down there with the Space Agency. I think, Enrico, you were there with some headphones on, pitching in. We were having an exercise to see if we could create a space domain picture, which we did. And that shows that Defence and ASA, there's a common need there to do the basic space domain awareness together. But also, when you look at some of the more classified things we want to do, look at the sensors, look at the mission systems, virtually all of that is in industry onshore today. So that's a good news story, in that there's an opportunity there for what's that one? That's 9360, to be able to lean out very well to what is already in country. And I think that's a good news first step we'll be making. Whereas it's more difficult with some of the more spaceborne technologies currently.
So we'll have a bit of a change of tack now to the question of diversity. So, which in some ways, if you're not reflecting your society in the leadership of your organisations, it almost is a bit of a security risk, I would say, in the future. It's important to reflect society in your leadership. But if we take a moment, like a stop check, at least from a gender diversity perspective in our space industry today, you've got Kath Roberts coming in, leading the defence story. You have Tanya Monroe leading the DST story. You have Eleanor Huntington coming in leading the CSIRO space story, the whole portfolio, under which Sarah Pierce, who's now leading SKA, was leading their space portfolio. Kimberly Clayfield's coming in to lead that. You've got Aude Vignel, CTO of the Australian Space Agency. Julie Bowen's here from Raytheon leading their space story. I could go on for 15 minutes. We're at a really, I don't think we really use this enough, you know. So I think my question is, we have a situation here with gender at least, which is a fantastic story to get out. How do we catalyze on that specifically? And what are you doing in your companies, institutions, agencies, which is maybe tackling the broader problem with diversity, which is also race and socioeconomic disadvantage, which never gets talked about, and it's a major, major issue. How can you afford education? How do you inspire kids to do it? I'm from a very poor area, not many people, and it's hard to get out. It's hard to get out. So how do we do that too? That's a big question. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we sponsor a National Youth Science Forum, so Melanie Bragg, and it was, I think initially when it stood up, it was a little bit more capital city focused, but it gets now out into the regions, which is good, where you can start to expose students to science and expose them to what good looks like and what industries look like, and particularly for young women to, okay, I can see here's Melanie, doctor, that sounds pretty interesting, and she's interested in science, so I might be interested in that. They're the kind of things that assist young people. It's showing what good looks like, you know, and the more you do, the more the young youth follow. You know, who did I meet? I think just briefly in the room, someone who decided they wanted to be a Sarah, I think, sitting over there somewhere, an astronomer at the age of 4, or maybe it was yourself.
No, it was me.
Yeah,
I said that.
they're great. See, I'm lost in space.
You've known each other for
Yeah,
a
but
minute.
at the age of 4, and what tweaked that? Something, you know, and we've all got stories like that in our life where you see something and you go, actually, I want to be that. That's what we've got to bring to the youth. We also do that through STEM punks, you know, sort of the name sort of attracts youth, but, you know, goes down to year 10 and it allows us to build that sort of knowledge and understanding so it can support projects like 9102 and 799 in the future. So that's what the Lockheed Martin's focus is, to get it into the schools, get traction where it should be, and celebrate people's success in the science field.
You know, I think for Northrop Grumman, it's a very similar journey. We run a competition called Cyber Taipan every year. We've been doing that for the last couple of years. The first year we had something like 100 students and 25 schools. This year, you know, up over 400 students, over 100 schools nationally, you know, teaming with the CSIRO. But I think it needs to be weaved into your strategy. You know, it needs to be underpinned by, you know, how you want to do business and valuing diversity as being an important part of that equation. So in what we do now, you know, we're building diversity. We're building, you know, working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. We're building in working with veterans into our very fabric because we value it and it adds value to what we do and how we deliver the outcomes. But there's a lot of hard work that needs to be done there. There's a lot of paradigms that you've got to turn around. But we believe, just like our values, you know, we do the right thing, we do what we promise, you know, we commit to that shared success and we pioneer. They're our values. And if you take those values seriously, then you have to value diversity. You have to value, you know, working with everybody. You have to value, you know, how you can bring that together to be better together.
If I may, there's two parts to this. One is what are we doing about it, one is also what is the situation. There's been, you say, some improvements in terms of roles and leadership, but most of the meetings I go to meetings where people look like me, which is a bit sad. The reason for that, even though in the space is part of space and dinosaurs, easy to recruit areas, my local space engineering team actually is relatively well diverse, but the pool we're digging from is somewhere between 16 and 20% of the STEM pipeline is female. That is really difficult then to try and get to an equity position if you're doing that, if the pipeline is already biased against doing that. So there's a lot of things then you've got to try and do to get over that. It starts with things like outreach. So Defence is a partner in the SmartSat CRC, which has an outreach program to improve diversification in the student population by encouraging through outreach activities. We have outreach activities ourselves. I know the Space Agency is also involved in those sort of outreach activities. For ourselves, DSTG is a Bronze SAGE awarded organisation, which is a commitment on the SAGE process to get to a gold medal status. There aren't any gold medal, I don't think, in Australia, which is an across-the-board diversity objective for the organisation. And therefore, part of our policies and our strategies, which include our cultural plan, drive us down a set of processes to get that diversity back onto, as it were, equal. That needs us to do certain things, and one of the things we do is, I think, called a bold initiative, which is, okay, we have to do something about it suddenly, because if we try and solve it through the STEM pipeline, there's 30-odd years before we see some equity in the organisation, and we haven't got that patience. So Tanya has launched a program called Navigate, which is a mid-year careers recruitment process with a 40% female requirement goal on it. And that's out now, and that will be a standing recruitment activity for the organisation. And the idea is to bring people in their mid-careers into the organisation to pump that up while we address the outreach at the lower levels. First year of doing it, so I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but it's a serious issue, and you can imagine if you speak to Tanya on this topic, she's driven.
She is.
Yeah. I think you grab the exemplars and you publicise it, where you can, providing, of course, they're comfortable. I mean, this morning I've come straight from a meeting where we're talking as the new space organisation in Defence about what we want our culture to be and how we will go forward. And the person who's leading that organisation very humbly at the very front said, we're now in a paradigm where those that run the organisation don't actually know or not the long-term experts in this particular domain. So Vice Marshal Kath Roberts is very clear saying, hey, look, I don't know a lot about space. She was very humble saying, actually, I don't know much. That's not true. That's a complete lie, and I'm happy to call her out on that. But in this case, she's right in terms of there's people with decades of experience that are within Defence that actually know what space is, and they're generally at the junior levels. And those people at the junior level, so the way we've set up the new organisation, almost called it what it was going to be, I'm sorry, it's going to be announced, I'm sorry. In terms of how we've set that up, we have a lot of flexibility in the way that we've got the rank structure. So generally we're very hierarchical in Defence. It's a flatter structure this time round. And we are pulling in enlisted ranks as opposed to all officers. We don't need to do that. And those sort of pathways are the way that we're looking at. Now, interestingly, there was a comment made to me from another country that said, oh, look, it's interesting that your boss is a female. I was like, actually, I hadn't noticed. In terms of professionally, I hadn't noticed. It doesn't make a difference to the way that we go about the organisation. She is the best person for the job, and that's the way we're moving forward. And I think it's a great sign of an emerging domain from a defence perspective in terms of where we're going to go. Some of you may know about Jarly, which is the Indigenous young animation that is there to recruit through the STEM pipeline. It's basically a young Indigenous girl who wants to go into space and into Mars, and it's a great little story that I watched. Not just, obviously I watched it, but I mean I watched a classroom of kids just glued to the screen. Now, animation helps, but the story itself was quite inspiring, and those sort of things are the way that we're looking at going forward. We are looking at using what we call our total workforce system. So we are working up a Defence strategic workforce plan that is cognizant of the sovereign requirement, so not just about filling defence positions. So it's about making the best use and where required, assisting the sovereign capability requirement. I think James, you told me there was about 800 or so kids that come through and graduate from universities with space-related degrees. Only 800 per year. So that's not going to fulfil the requirement for defence. It's not going to fulfil a requirement for industry, and certainly for academia. So we need to understand how we can be a little more diverse. And we certainly are not saying that we need space people in space. We need more people in space, and we can make them space people. So.
Excellent. Well, just our organisation, InSpace is 75% women with a target to start with 50%. And so for any advice to anyone starting something, it's much easier to reach those goals when you're starting something than it is to try and, change an institution that already is. So I'm sure if you've got some really great ideas and great companies you want to spin out, all this kind of stuff, that's when you need to make it matter and reach out to a diverse group of people. I'm kind of thinking we should go to Q&A. Are you okay with that? You've said what, yeah.
You've
Any
already gone off
questions?
script, so I don't...
I didn't think we could make any decisions here. I thought you were in charge.
Oh, right, okay. So we're going to go for Q&A.
Yeah.
Malcolm.
Someone's running over. Yeah.
He stole the only microphone, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Got the next one.
Malcolm Davis, Aspie. Question to the panel. When I look at key defence space projects like JP9102 and DEF 799 and the various different others that are out there, they're all essentially reaching fruition in the late 2020s or into the mid-2030s. And yet our strategic environment is deteriorating much more rapidly than the pace of capability acquisition inherent in those programs. So my question to you is, how do we accelerate our capability acquisition for space? And is there an opportunity here to help SMEs, local startups, by providing the low end of a high-low mix, so that rather than just relying purely on very large, expensive, complex satellites and geo, that are vulnerable targets for counter space capabilities, we augment our space capabilities and have larger numbers of satellites that can be contributed by local companies and launched from Australia? Is that a way to actually kickstart and accelerate the development of space industry in this country? Because frankly, we don't have a lot of time to wait for traditional capability acquisition processes to run through.
Yep. I like how you all looked at me. That was nice. So, look, I agree, Malcolm. I do entirely that the way that... now, I can speak on this because 9102 has not come to the new space organisation yet. There's a hint it's coming to us. It will come to us. 799 parts, well, we'll see in due course. How about that? There is recognition that we need to move faster. We do recognise the fact that that the way that things have been set up is for, like I mentioned before, an uncontested domain. So things do need to change. This is the comment I was making. You need to give me the room to manoeuvre. That's my Christmas present that Anna's going to give me at some point. How she does that, it's all a mystery to me. So, but in terms of that, we need to change the paradigm in which we set the requirements, then go through the development process and then acquire. That's what has to change. And in fact, this morning, AVM Roberts was talking exactly to that. How do we set that up? And we have that opportunity in space to move faster. The urgency is there. The rhetoric is already there. We just need to make sure that whole of government is across what we're going to do as we move faster. And I think the appetite is there. I do. I've not personally been through an entire gate 0 through to 2 process. I've not lost all of my hair yet, but give it time. But we intend to move faster and challenge the governance, because as the domain stands up, we're going to challenge all of the norms that sit there right now. So that's my, and I'm happily stand up to that testament.
So you probably hit something that's near and dear to my heart, but I think that when you look at what we're trying to do here in Australia, both from a defence perspective and from a civil perspective, agility and the agile methodologies that we want to adopt, will be fundamental to our future. If you look at the way in which defence does business at the moment, it starts with requirement certainty. I alluded to before, where we sit today in space, having pulled services from space, having controlled partial payloads in space, to where we want to go into the future, controlling the whole payload, controlling the satellite, controlling the constellation, from GEO, MEO, LEO. That's something new for us. That's not requirements, that's outcomes, because we don't know what we don't know in that particular regard. A successful outcome, in this space is getting your strategy right. The next part of the equation is engaging all stakeholders, which goes to the alignment that we talked about. In the future, it won't be about requirement certainty. For projects like 9102, what are we specifying? What's the functional performance spec look like? Because we don't know. We've never done it before, but we're going to have to learn. It's about outcomes. With agility, Agility doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. It doesn't mean the A doesn't stand for ad hoc. It actually requires more discipline, more regular decision-making to manage the risk that comes with doing things more rapidly. But you're taking things to the field, at the speed of the threat, or in the commercial context to give you a commercial advantage. And then the next part of that equation, the business case for doing that, having got the strategy right, aligning your stakeholders, articulating outcomes, not necessarily requirements, and having the governance that goes with that, is getting the right approach. Is firm fixed price right when you're starting to do something that you don't know, what you don't know? And the answer is it requires relational contracting. It requires a different way of doing business. It requires an enterprise view of the world. And within that enterprise, then you can actually nurture the ecosystem that supports that. If you do that right, then you get organisational buy-in. All of those stakeholders will back you. They're aligned to the strategy. And if you get that right, that organisational buy-in, you'll get the organisational resources to get it done.
Can I just quickly put in, because essentially what you're advocating is like a hybrid approach. We put integrated systems, and then we can augment it with quick go-to-market type approaches. And actually, if you go back to Catherine's, I suppose it's now her last job, Roberts, the hack strat, go through that process. It talks about temporal capability that is not supported, for a long period of time. Bring things in quickly, a little bit of capability for a short period of time, then out of service, because there's cost benefits of doing things that way. Space lends itself to doing that. I mean, there's a company in the audience today who's building me a satellite with the payload we're doing locally. That's got a military mission, and they'll go up, do a mission for a couple of years, and then come down again. We do have a problem. One problem with this at the moment is the time from I have got a contract for you to thank you for the satellite is way too long still. They need to be months, not years. And at the moment, we're struggling to get to that tempo. So that, I don't know what's causing that. That's something worth investigating. Supplier, chains, whatever it is, there's something causing a problem.
One more question, please.
Russell.
Preferably from a woman, if possible.
So, Russell Boyce, Director
okay.
of UNSW Campus.
He's prepared to go through change.
Yesterday afternoon, I prefaced the question by saying that space is hard, and my team know that from experience. Therefore, developing the future workforce, the future skilled space workforce, it requires grappling with that issue of that space is hard, and you only get to truly know that and build the skills by doing space and by having the challenges, the road bumps. Macca, you know that well. We've talked about that. Therefore, on behalf of the university sector, on behalf of the educators, we believe that Australia needs to be investing in opportunities for students to learn space by doing space, not just reading about it in textbooks. So, two-part question for the panel. Do you agree with that? And if you agree with that, are you prepared, Defence, Primes, are you prepared to come alongside the university sector and help us educate, build the future skilled workforce through immersing them in space experiences?
Okay, well, I can kick in then first. There's a bit of a loaded question, Russell. The fact is that, yes, that's where the training and development starts. And you're right, this is a highly practical element of experiential learning that's to take place. I've taken the same approach myself with my own capability teams. The reason why we have these early satellite programs that are inside Defence was to actually bring a team up to speed and learn how to do space. And we've done that in partnership with you in one particular instance. One of the mantras I have is that through the technology investments made by, say, Defence, that it must have a pathway to be put into space, because there's a lot of learning that goes on the pathway to get it into space. Yes, some of that is a university journey, but also some of it has to be in industry as well, and they learn as well by being in space, because eventually the procurement is done with industry. So as long as it's part of a pathway, I think it's my caveat result.
Yeah. Space is hard, and I applaud those that try it and then try again. And that's the most important aspect. For Lockheed Martin, we do that. We're partnered with Curtin for space situational awareness, and we'll provide that to Defence if they so desire. So there are good examples of where companies do that.
From a Northrop Grumman perspective, fundamentally, we want to team with you. You know, it gets back to our strategy. If we want to play in 9102, DEF 799, space-based ISR, space domain awareness, then we have to do that. We have to be working with you, you know, to engage, enthuse, educate and employ. You know, our future is reliant on, you know, that skilling and STEM aspect. And as I said, skilling and STEM starts at the strategic front end. You know, as we're working with Defence, understanding where they want to go, you know, then we're building that same path forward. So the answer is we have to engage with you.
But who do we engage with, Russ? And you know, we are bombarded regularly by academia. There is no single voice, which, you know, strangely enough, we get that. There's a lot of people competing, and is not necessarily a sovereign plan for going ahead. So from a defence perspective, we don't know what skill sets we need to train our people for yet. So we're in the process of doing that workforce analysis. That will then lead to a training analysis, training design, and then training implementation. So we will be in contact in due course, and we already have programs that we run through the University of New South Wales, as you know, Russ. I realise that was a leading question, but we just don't have all the answers yet. The Chief of Air Force calls it building a flying, sorry, we're building the aeroplane as we're flying. It's not quite right. We're actually building the rocket as we've already launched. So, you know, you've got to keep it in context. So.
I think we need, one more question, really? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
You'd have to announce that.
Hello, Nicole Sells, Northrop Grumman, Australia. Just going back to sovereignty and the ground segment, I'd just like to understand the panel's view on that. I think, you know, a bit of clarity and focus on how we deliver sovereignty and taking on comments around, you know, specifically the global context of the supply chain opportunity and competitive advantage. I'd just like to hear a little more on what the panel and their experience and wisdom really shows about how we build succinct paths to sustainable revenue creation. Thank you.
Anyone?
I think I started that conversation with the space domain awareness example I was alluding to. Because that's got a very rich ground element because of the primary role of what is going on, how do we avoid bumping into things, and what are people doing in space. And that leads to all those classic technologies of networking integration and sensing and mission processing. There is a wealth of capability in industry already that can do those sort of tasks. Simplistically, the job for us in defence is to we can reach the marketplace to find solutions to that, but on the journey there is to put things on the shelf through the R&D investments to make sure that we have got something which is as much as an open standard as possible, and also something which the Commonwealth can have some IP investment in, such that it can then do the rapid update and change to it. When we have, and this is, I'm going to speak for the S&T and R&D side, made such controls of IP, we also say that we were prepared to license as well outside of the work being done for defence. And if you can get to the marketplace with low-cost solutions which are very easy to update, there's probably a niche there that someone can do, but I'm not going to say there is because I'm not a marketing industrial person. But I think that we have had successes in the past where we've developed Commonwealth IP and then licensed it back again for industry to make export market. So that's the sort of area I was thinking of. So there's a wealth of capability, but we want to have it very accessible for us to update, which means we control IP, but then we will license it.
Yeah, your question is well placed. We're fascinated what's above, but the complexity sits down beneath. So my past experience in defence, I was tortured by Joint Project 2008, A&A wrote a novel about it. I'm not sure if you're aware about that. They're very balanced writers. It was an interesting read, quite comprehensive, but to be fair, they pretty well got to the nub of it. And it was bifurcation of a complex system. You wouldn't choose to chop it up into segmented pieces, even though at the time, for the people who were involved, it would have made perfect sense. But to deliver a system such as that, you needed a Jesus nut over the top to pull it all together. And that's where it came apart. So I would say, from experiences, if we go forward again, let's not break it out into component parts. Let's keep it together, as hard as it is. But complex projects are hard, but they're much more difficult if you break them into pieces and don't talk to each other. An example would be exasperation that we were waiting on the fire door code to be approved before we could move to acceptance for a particular part of 2008. I do remember physically just tapping my head against my desk when that came up. So yes, don't bifurcate it all.
So I think while Nicole comes from Northrop Grumman, I didn't cede the question, but look, I think the ground segment and the certification of ground segments, getting the network management systems, getting the space control part of this, is the riskiest part for us as we're moving forward, and delivering capability. I talked before about space control. In the military parlance, I'd use the term space battle management. I'm not sure what the civil or commercial equivalent of that is, but it's the things that's going to give us in the civil domain our commercial advantage to make us globally competitive, across all of what we do here, digital economy, to make Australia prosperous and otherwise. So that's about the difference between space control is, just turning stuff on and off in space, or communicating through space, or doing all of those things that we do in space. Space battle management is adding the exploitation, the situational awareness, as Andrew said before, the exploitation and dissemination of that information, either from a military perspective or from a commercial perspective, to make us globally competitive, to give us that commercial advantage. So we've got to get that part right at the end of the day. That's the part that has to be sovereign and it has to be resilient. And we have to have that control over those outcomes, for Australia at the end of the day. To your second point, Nicole, I think the key issue for me is not trying to be all things to all people. When you look at the resources we get and the timeframes over which that's spent, then we have to leverage that to maximum advantage. And what we establish has to be, it's like building the pyramids. We've got to create that firm foundation. And every one of those foundational elements, while it might start small, we have to keep on building on it. We have to build the base of the industry that is playing in this game so that they're sustainable in their own right. And to that then comes, well, what's the strategy? What are we trying to do? To Andrew's point before about where are we focusing our attention? Is it on the fridge-sized satellites, the 1,000 kilo G-class bus type satellites? Is it the CubeSat? Are we going to play in the 3,000 kilo class that will probably play into JP9102? Is that where we really want to be? Because we can't be all things to all people. And when we again look at the infrastructure, the skilling and STEM, and how we're going to feed that, the business upskilling, they're all those key things that we have to invest in. We have to make sure, provide that firm foundation. I always get the parable and the three little pigs story wrong. Building on the rock, not on the sand, building with bricks, not with sticks or straw. We've got to be building on the rock. We have to be building with the bricks. We have to be investing in making sure that industry outcome that we're establishing is sustainable and viable into the longer term. And we've got to focus our efforts initially. We've got to align our dollars and make sure that we're building that firm base to build on and to be the space nation.
Can I just... Sorry, mate. So this is a bit quick, because there's a bit of a premise as well. And I think I just want to move us forward to say it's 2028, 2030-ish. Okay, so I've now got my ground station. Okay, I'm going to load my 799 app Okay. Oh, there's 2 of the satellites do need a software update, by the way, by the looks of it. And I'm just going to put a query in. Where is Macca parked? You need a new ticket. So I don't want ground stations to be highly integrated single system. I want them to be available to every user who wants to operate the systems. So there's a bit of a jump to get there and for the future. So that's where I want it to be, because they're more resilient, because there'll be millions, thousands of these things. Not one. Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate there's the competency in terms of technology, but in the programs of getting into place, there's back to the how many years does it take problem. Yeah. Given the freedom, he'll do it. Yeah.
I think we're well
sorry,
over
Anna.
now, guys. Sorry. Yeah, but thank you so much today. I hope everyone got some insights out of that. It was really a pleasure to host this panel. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna.